Did I expect that 32 minutes of rambling would get this much attention? No. Am I going to capitalize on it? Yes. First of all, before I talk about anything from the previous video, guys, I have to make a crucial announcement. There is a sequel to the Family Guy analog horror, if you can believe it. And wow, the story elements here are impeccable. I have a fully fleshed out lore proposal here. This is the most important deep dive since the discovery of the Pop-Tarts cinematic universe. In this sequel, we can basically see Chris Griffin's madness reach a breaking point, and instead of simply sitting back and watching the horrible things that happen in every Family Guy episode, he snaps, and in these final shots, we could see Chris become one of the animals he was so afraid of. I cannot take myself seriously. This is actually ridiculous. Hey guys, and welcome back to the Seed Butter channel. If you're here after watching my recent criticism of analog horror, or just anal if you're watching it on the computer, welcome back. And if you haven't seen that video, I implore you to check it out briefly first. Otherwise, much of what I say here won't make a ton of sense. But yeah, basically everything I could have expected to happen with my old video did. We had a ton of conversation, people critiquing my thoughts, building off my suggestions, but most importantly, some new writers taking in some of my criticisms, which can hopefully boost the quality of analog horror that comes out in the future. Anyways, I wanted to take a quick second. Actually, no, not a quick second. I'm once again going to ramble for far too long. I thought I wanted to clarify a bit of what I said in the last video and add one or two more points that I thought about discussing at that time, but I didn't. I also want to echo or reply to some of the comments that I got. Also, this will be the only update, so relax, I'm not going to complain about the state of analog horror anymore unless I have something really important to say, which I don't imagine I will. I want to use this update to just hone down a bit of what I said and then go back on to covering other cool stuff. So as always, stay tuned. But in general, the primary reaction I personally had to my video was relief. Relief that I wasn't just making this up and it wasn't just me. That other people are getting sick of the tropes that are starting to pop up everywhere in analog horror. I'll mention how analog horror is getting memed left and right throughout this video, like the sequel to the Family Guy analog horror I mentioned earlier. What followed for me was, at first, a general resignation. A resignation, perhaps, that, just like creepypastas, for example, that the age of analog horror is behind us. But in the end, I failed to truly accept that. Every single time I have talked about analog horror conceptually, and very frequently when other people talk about it, we inevitably spend time having to differentiate between loads of related concepts. Is it analog horror? Is it digital horror? If it has at least one puzzle, is it an alternate reality game? Or is it even unfiction, as Nightmind would put it? Thanks for commenting on my last video, by the way. Here's the thing, guys, normies do not care whatsoever about these things. And to be frank, I'm not anymore either. I find myself constantly misusing the terms of analog horror and ARG. I literally did it in the previous video and just corrected it with a subtitle. To an extent, if this medium is to continue, we need to let go of these individual distinctions and maybe just appreciate analog horror for what it really is. Internet horror made from individuals and small channels as opposed to big studios, following a general trend of VHS-based presentation and found footage concepts that are traced back to some of the first series in the game. A lot of people in the comments were telling me that analog horror went the way of the creepypasta, for example, where they just got oversaturated, and there was a golden age, but it has come and passed. And at first, I agreed, but when I really thought about it, I don't think it makes sense. Skinamarink had a massive success. My dad, who has never watched analog horror in his entire life, loved it. The Backrooms are going to get a movie. Now, the Backrooms kind of turned into their own type of horror. Backrooms horror could be just as valid of a term as analog horror is, but you know what? Who cares? They're similar enough. I think at this point, there's a growing trend of small creators making horror with their roots generally in YouTube, or at least the creators have some YouTube experience, and it's making its way mainstream. And however you want to define this phenomenon as a whole, analog horror contributed to it in a meaningful way. Let's look again at Skinamarink. No, it's not the most popular film ever made, but it did extremely well commercially and artistically. Now, really quick, I'm going to spoil some shots of that movie and talk about it for a sec, so skip right here if you don't want any of that. But just look at how much this film is rooted in analog horror. Even the spooky faces that I complained about in my last video that are so overused nowadays showed up in this film. The way it's filmed, the childlike perspective where you don't have control over your surroundings and you don't fully understand what's going on, coupled with the nostalgic presentation of television and childhood and such, it all goes back to analog horror. And the idea of a monster, and personally, I believe there is an actual monster or entity in this film. I know that's kind of up for debate, but again, personally, I believe it's an actual monster. That has its roots in analog horror as well. It's a monster that you hear. It's a monster that hurts you. It's a monster that warps and perverses reality. But at the end of the film, it's not a monster that you get closure on. It's not a monster you fully understand or see. In analog horror, you often have to deal with incomplete information because you're only getting certain sources. News reports, evidence, or whatever it might be. It's never a full David Attenborough documentary on what scary thing just happened. And it's the same thing here with this movie, although the mechanics are just a little bit different. The point is, this is an example of this quote-unquote type of art being extremely successful, whatever you want to call it. So if we're willing to let go of the label a little bit and ease off of what we consider analog horror, we can quickly disprove the idea that analog horror is done for. Yes, depending on how you look at it, creepypastas, SCPs, and things like that did get oversaturated. They all also had opportunities to go mainstream like analog horror is right now. And there's no indication that mainstream analog horror will fail the way that creepypasta movies did. Now, let's pivot for just a second here. There's still definitely traditional analog horror. There are vids on YouTube uploaded constantly that maybe literally say analog horror in the title. Yeah, things like the Backrooms movie and similar stuff are coming out, and analog horror will make its mark on theatrical and popular horror as a whole, but there is still just the normal, small-scale, edgy, and sometimes goofy YouTube videos. That culture still exists. So we don't need to act like it's doomed as a whole. It's just changing and going mainstream, and the stuff that's left on the platform is definitely going through a bit of a hard time. I think now we can talk about that part. For the rest of this video, I'm once again going to criticize analog horror that's coming out nowadays and mention the good points that you guys all made in the comments. Now, one of my biggest pet peeves, actually no, my biggest issue with analog horror in the present day that I sort of mentioned in the first part is when creators aren't consistent with how they frame their horror. I didn't really make that point clear, so let me define it now. Yes, analog horror, as a definition, is more about the influence of VHS tapes and how you'd splice them together and how they decay, but as a genre, it's also marked by the fact that you have to unravel information and put things together. What this means is that projects mix primary, secondary, and maybe even tertiary levels of story, where a primary source is horror directly capturing the antagonist or scary thing. A secondary source is where characters within the story react to said thing, and a tertiary source is when the creators self-insert themselves as if they're unraveling the mystery personally. Here's an example. Let's say someone goes into the woods, filming themselves exploring an abandoned cabin where they find a torture room made by a serial killer full of VHS tapes. They don't have a VHS player, so they give the tapes to you and ask you to figure out the mystery. Now this is a super lame example, but bear with me. The actual tape of a serial killer murdering someone is the primary level. The character who came across this evidence is the secondary level. And then the narrator who watches the footage in the comfort of their home is the tertiary level. Frequently, projects will upload to YouTube one piece of primary level horror, usually the first upload, as a hook, and then lots of secondary level stuff to drip feed the story and provide exposition. While this is all happening, whoever is writing in the video descriptions or acting as a historian after the fact and putting it all together is usually at the tertiary level. Here's an example. Look at this project here and how I've divided it out. Further, if we look in the descriptions, we would see that the way it's narrated is the tertiary level. Now, I'm sorry for getting way too serious and scientific about this, but over-explaining is the only way I could really show what's driving me crazy. Occasionally, but rarely, should the levels of horror mix. If they do, it should be climactic or otherwise sensible. And it does happen, but frequently it's incorrectly happening. For example, if you're watching a primary level thing, so maybe body cam footage, security cameras, or something of the like, it should be terrifying. It should include chase sequences, murder, ghosts, whatever the horrible thing is. But if you're watching secondary level stuff, like an educational tape for employees, which seems to be common in the genre, or a police report, jump scares don't belong there. If you're making a tape for employees to educate themselves on how dangerous dinosaurs are, to educate them, why on earth would there be a jump scare there? If you're recording a police report in audio form, why on earth would there be a jump scare there as well? It's evidence to be presented in a courtroom, not a found footage movie. The characters at this level shouldn't be in obvious danger. Further, the tertiary level is the story's narrator. It's the guy in Petscop who found the game. It's the guy in Valle Verde who dug up the VHS tapes. It's the person in the Adult Swim Lost Media series who found old recordings from their childhood. Paradoxically, the tertiary level characters often end up in danger because there's a trope in this kind of writing where the antagonist hunts down whoever is unraveling the mystery. It usually starts out subtly, maybe a letter in the mail telling you to stop investigating, or the tertiary narrator describing that they're being followed, or weird things are happening to them, or something to that effect. But it takes time to build that up. It's subtle. So at the tertiary level, you shouldn't expect jump scares or stupidly loud audio cues or freaking subtitles that literally tell you to be afraid of something. I kind of danced around this point in the first part, but I really wanted to iron it out right here. I'm not saying this is a surefire rule. Some creators bend this, mix it up, or don't even follow it at all, and that's all fine and good. It's just my observation. My guidelines here are not perfect. But what is sure, regardless of whether or not these guidelines are used, is that when they're messed up in the way I have described, the experience, for me at least, is problematic. If you choose to present different levels of horror, different distances in perspective from the terror, don't mix them without good reason. Sometimes I'm watching pieces of analog horror and I'm supposed to be gathering evidence and getting invested in the story, thinking of theories and scanning intently for background details. And then, as one of my astute commenters put it, I get jump scared by a deformed image of the giggle shitter in all his glory, accompanied by 120 decibels of sheer screeching and visual decay. In my opinion, for an analog horror project to be good, not every single upload needs to try and inspire fear. Tension needs to be built, stakes need to be raised, plot needs to advance, without attempting to use cheap horror. A resounding theme in the comments of the last video was that I talked a whole lot, and that is true, and some people also thought that I just complained. And I see where you're coming from, as that video was ultimately a critique, but I'll try right here to turn those critiques into communicable advice for creators, or at least just say what I personally want to see from series in the future. First off, whatever level of horror you want to show, primary, secondary, whatever you want to call it, however far you want to distance the narration from the horror, keep it consistent. Educational tapes and news broadcasts don't need to be full of choppy scares if there's not a good reason to. Next, be willing to focus more on story and less on fear. Yes, I'm sure creating a good, well-executed scare is probably the best feeling in the world for horror creators, but you aren't losing anything by making episodes which add details and plot. Again, not everything needs to be an attempt to scare, because inevitably, if you try and make 100 scares versus just one good one, the 100 scares are going to be full of crap telling us to be scared instead of just being scared. Like I mentioned in my first video, show, don't tell. There was a little anecdote that I thought about when I made my first video, but I didn't talk about it. I think since you're willing to sit through 2 parts, I'm going to add it here. I was in Boy Scouts, and in Boy Scouts, acting out skits is a big thing. There's a ton of super common ones that everyone knows and can generally play whenever, like the classic Invisible Bench. Any scouts in my audience will know what that one is for sure. But one of my favorites is the buffalo poop skit. The first guy walks down a path and sees buffalo poop. He exclaims and says, "That looks like buffalo poop." Then the next guy walks up and goes down, takes a good sniff of it and goes, "Wow, that smells like buffalo poop." The third guy touches it and repeats the same thing. It feels like buffalo poop. Now you can stretch this pattern out as far as you want depending on how many actors you have, but the final guy usually goes to the buffalo poop, pretends to taste it, and then says, "Wow, this tastes like buffalo poop." Then he looks at his friends and they all go, "Good thing we didn't step in that," and then they move on. The joke, of course, is that while they did manage to avoid stepping in the poop, they ended up touching, tasting, and sniffing it in the process. Now at this point you might think I have a mental health diagnosis, but bear with me. When you make filler episodes in analog horror, you're not wasting time. You're adding detail. Scary themes are just like the buffalo poop. Before I'm jump scared, I should have reason to think. This seems scary. This looks scary. This feels scary. This sounds scary. It might even smell scary. I'm not kidding. Obviously, your audience won't directly experience it themselves, but you can include taste or smell being off in horror. It happens all the time. I should have every reason to feel off before you attempt to scare me. If you don't understand the threat, the antagonist, then it's just a jump scare. But if you've pieced together what evil is going on and what the hypothetical consequences are, the fear legitimizes itself and grows even scarier. And in my opinion, the lack of this is how we could really sum up the issues with analog horror. Rushing to the scare at the expense of a good story, as well as a lack of originality. Not only are many characters failing to make good stories, but they're subject to the same pitfalls. They're all using the wrong kinds of jump scares, they're all using VHS decay to be scary, and they're all using those freaking faces. This in turn is why analog horror gets memed so much. And I'm here for it. It's funny and it's fair criticism. There are at least a few videos on YouTube that literally just show face decay with a jump scare, which is what the genre kind of feels like. Going on from what I started with, I'll rattle off a few more things I want to see in the genre. Let's get some new types of antagonists. As cool as body horror and the uncanny valley is with analog horror, I'm kind of ready for something new. No more alternates or shapeshifters. Give me an alien, or at this point even a robot dog with rabies. Just not creepy looking people anymore. Next, I think creators need to move back to a seasonal model of content. Lots of series have done or even still do this, but I think if creators penned a several episode series and got the uploading consistent, providing seasonal micro closures to the story, it wouldn't feel so hyper-saturated, the pacing would be better, and it would up the quality. Next is to start using a camera again. Some of my favorite analog horror bits were filmed outside with a camera and the creators touching grass. Projects don't need this every single time, but I think a mix of at least 20% authentic footage and just the remainder being editing or whatnot makes the best projects. Also, media mixing in general is just super fun when every video is a little bit different. Next, for the love of all things holy, please do not use AI voiceovers. I know it can be nerve-wracking to present yourself or any form of yourself online. I mean, I run a faceless YouTube channel, like, I get it. You might not like your face, you might not like your voice, but I can promise you, unless you're doing like a really, really well done EAS video, which you probably aren't, just use your actual voice. I would rather listen to the most obnoxious voice in the world than TikTok text-to-speech. Finally, I've come to appreciate humor in analog horror a bit more, because I found if the footage is supposed to be natural and human and not really all acted out, it can totally have jokes in it. Anyways, to end this video on a positive note, I'll do what I can to recommend, or at the very least, individually praise some projects that are ongoing, regardless of size, and tell you why I like them. They're just some random ones that have been on my mind recently. Hopefully I can recommend some new content for y'all to binge that may or may not lift your spirits about the state of the medium. Number one is Urban Spook. I'm just kidding. I'm absolutely joking. Number one, Valle Verde. I have not been silent at all about this being maybe my favorite project in the scene. To my knowledge, I was the first one on YouTube to even cover it. It's about the channel creator finding a lost tape of a video game, and I know that sounds really overdone, but the minute you start watching the footage, you'll be blown away by how talented the creator is. Not only that, but he's mixing a ton of media here. It's presented authentically like a PS1 game, but there's also an original soundtrack and all sorts of other elements. If you like Catastrophe Crow, I think this is 3 times better. Now, there's a bit of a twist in the second episode that I won't spoil, but it takes the series in a huge new direction too. I've been wanting to cover it again, but I'm waiting for a new update before I go crazy into theorizing. I guess that gets to the only real negative for this series, which is how infrequent the updates are. However, the last one came out 3 months ago, so we'll probably see an update within 6 months, and for that reason, I encourage you to sub to the project right now and binge the uploads. It has to do with lost video game media, but also random deep topics like religion and even Argentinian art and politics, oddly enough. I can't recommend this one enough though. Number 2, Greylock. Don't get me wrong, Greylock does include a lot of the things I criticized in this video, but it also does a lot of good. It features a fantastic mix of mediums, all sorts of different upload types, including the filming in those 10 sequences I described. It's been a bit since the last upload, but a lot of you guys recommended it, which actually made me go through and watch everything, and I really enjoyed it. Something I came across very recently that, spoiler alert, I might cover soon, is a smaller project called Eventide Media Center. I haven't gone crazy into analyzing it yet, but the plot is super intriguing. The idea of the antagonist, I guess, is not something I would have thought of, and the analog presentation is actually done fairly tastefully. It's got some funny bits in it too. This one's super unique, and I think it's criminally under-subbed to, so go check it out. Next is a series that I actually did make a video on called Alta Paradisus, made by this small creator. And funnily enough, they had gone back to making other stuff for a long time after my video went out about that project, and soon after I uploaded my analysis, like less than a month or two, they went back to uploading that series. So as far as I know, that story is still on. Most of it is editing and not original footage, but the segments of original footage really stand out, as you'll understand if you watch it. The story and antagonist are so freaking unique that I implore you to go watch them. Like seriously, the quote-unquote villain is a super interesting reveal, and I think you should see it for yourself. Number 5 is Vermis Malum. I got into this one after watching the Nightmind video on it, and honestly, I'm super duper curious as to where this one's gonna go. There's a healthy mix of game footage, nostalgia, and even tense, scary sequences, without a lot of the tropes I described earlier. They're still at a pretty low sub count for how good the videos are, so I hope anyone watching this video can push them over the 10K mark. I know that was only 5 things, but I did want to end this video in a way that pointed out some positives. Not all of analog horror is just memes now. There are still lots of gems to find out there. But we do have to support and sub to those channels if we're going to convince them to keep going. As some of my commenters mentioned, it's possible that a lot of these edgy, goofy ones we criticize, like Urban Spook, are just made by or watched by kids. Okay, well, hopefully not Urban Spook, because that has some pretty disgusting themes in it, but at least a good amount of the audience for these lower quality projects with no substance or story are just kids. We have to fight against the masses of them that want to upload and watch utter garbage by supporting the ones we find that are good. So, if you like analog horror, like I do, and you find something fun, make sure you show love, like the video, subscribe, and maybe even join their Discord or something if they have one. I know if I were an analog horror creator, I would want to see people trying to unravel my mystery, and that would probably inspire me a bunch. So, anyways guys, thanks once again for listening to my ramblings. I appreciate your time here today, and I won't take up any more of it. I've got a unique video coming up where I'll be partnering with a YouTuber you'll surely know if you're into cryptids, so stay tuned for that. It'll be something a little different for me, but it's a topic that I was thinking about for a while, and I'm glad to get back to it. Also, thank you all for the continued support lately. We're actually going to be hitting Seed Butter's 3rd birthday soon, and it would be super cool to reach 55,000 subs before that day. So if you're on the fence about subbing, know that I really appreciate your kindness, and every subscriber helps. Have a good night, I appreciate you all, and see you super duper soon.